The $300 trillion debt bomb that will end the global economy. There's a number so large it's almost impossible to imagine. $300 trillion. That's the total amount of debt owed by governments, corporations, and households across the planet. It's more than 3 times the size of the entire global economy, and it's still growing by billions every single day. This isn't just a statistic, it's a warning, because every empire, every civilization, and every financial system that drowned in debt met the same fate. Collapse. The global economy today is built not on gold, not on production, not even on innovation, but on debt. And like every debt bubble in history, it can only expand so long before the weight of its own promises causes it to implode. When that moment comes, there will be no bailout large enough, no central bank powerful enough, and no currency stable enough to stop it. To understand why, we need to go back to the beginning, to the moment when money stopped being real. The birth of the debt age in 1971. President Richard Nixon made a decision that changed the world economy forever. He ended the Bretton Woods system, the last link between the US dollar and gold. For decades after World War II, the dollar had been convertible to gold at $35 an ounce, anchoring the global monetary system in something tangible. But by the late 1960s, America was spending far more than it could afford on war in Vietnam, on welfare programs, on global military bases. Foreign nations began demanding gold instead of dollars, and the U.S. gold reserves started to drain away. On August 15, 1971, Nixon went on television and announced that the U.S. would temporarily suspend the dollar's convertibility to gold. It was supposed to be a short-term fix. It became permanent. Money was no longer tied to anything real. It became an idea, a promise printed by governments and expanded by banks. That was the birth of the fiat money era, the beginning of the modern debt explosion. Because once money could be created with a keystroke, there was no longer any natural limit to how much debt could exist. Every dollar created was now someone else's liability, and every liability could be rolled over, refinanced, and multiplied endlessly. The rise of the credit machine from 1971 onward, the world entered a feedback loop of debt and growth. The U.S. national debt was about $400 billion. Then, today, it's over $35 trillion. Japan's debt has reached 260% of its GDP. China's total debt, corporate, local, and national, has soared past $50 trillion. Across the planet, debt has grown faster than population, faster than wages, faster than productivity. In the 1980s, deregulation and financial innovation turned borrowing into an art form. The invention of credit cards, mortgage-backed securities, and corporate bonds gave consumers and companies access to easy money. Governments learned that voters loved low taxes and high spending, and that central banks could quietly finance it all through inflation. By the 1990s, the idea of permanent expansion had become an article of faith. Economists promised that debt didn't matter as long as economies kept growing. Alan Greenspan, the Federal Reserve chairman, famously said that the Fed could mitigate any financial crisis through liquidity injections. In plain English, whenever the system stumbled, print more money. The results were predictable. Each boom was followed by a bigger bust, and each bust was rescued by even more borrowing. 1987's stock market crash, the 1997 Asian crisis, the 2000 dot-com collapse, the 2008 mortgage meltdown, the 2020 pandemic shutdown, each time. Central banks slashed interest rates, governments unleashed stimulus, and global debt surged higher than before. How money became debt? Here's the core problem. In a modern fiat system, every dollar is born as debt. When a government issues a bond, that bond becomes new money once a bank buys it. When you take a loan, the bank doesn't lend out existing cash, it creates new deposits out of thin air. The economy only grows if someone, somewhere, is willing to borrow. And when borrowing stops, everything stops. That's why politicians panic at the mere mention of austerity. Without more debt, GDP contracts, asset prices fall, and unemployment rises. The entire system has become addicted to leverage and addiction, fed by 40 years of falling interest rates. In 1981, the U.S. 10-year Treasury yield was 15%. By 2021, it was barely 1%. Cheap money allowed governments, corporations, and consumers to stack debt upon debt, believing the cost of borrowing would always remain low. Then came 2022. Inflation exploded to levels not seen since the 1970s. The Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, and others had no choice but to raise rates. Within 18 months, borrowing costs increased faster than at any time in modern history. The world's most indebted system suddenly discovered it couldn't handle expensive money. The fragile foundation today, the United States, spends more than $1 trillion a year just on interest payments, more than its entire defense budget. Japan spends nearly half its tax revenue servicing its debt. Italy owes more than its economy produces in a year. China's local governments are quietly defaulting on infrastructure loans they can't repay. Emerging markets are in even worse shape. Egypt, Pakistan, Argentina, and dozens of others are begging the IMF for relief. Global interest rate hikes have triggered a wave of sovereign debt crises unseen since the 1980s. But the real danger isn't in any one country. It's that the entire global financial system is built on the assumption that debt will always be rolled over, that tomorrow will always bring more credit than today. If that assumption fails, the chain reaction will be unstoppable. When governments borrow from the future, every dollar a government spends beyond its income is a claim on the future. Politicians promise social programs, subsidies, and wars without ever asking who will pay the bill. They borrow against generations not yet born. In the United States, the Congressional Budget Office projects annual deficits of more than $2 trillion for the foreseeable future. That means America will add a new trillion in debt roughly every 6 months. To cover that borrowing, the Treasury issues bonds, which investors buy mostly banks, pension funds, and foreign governments. But what happens when buyers disappear? In 2024, the U.S. faced its lowest demand for Treasury bonds in decades. Japan and China, once the largest foreign holders, are selling. The Federal Reserve, once the buyer of last resort, is trying to shrink its balance sheet. That leaves private markets to absorb record issuance at higher yields. It's a vicious circle. Higher debt requires higher interest rates, which make the debt even harder to sustain. Every empire that tried to finance itself through endless borrowing eventually met the same end. The Roman Empire debased its silver coinage until it was almost worthless. The French monarchy borrowed so heavily in the 18th century that it triggered revolution. The British Empire lost its financial dominance after World War II under the weight of debt. History's message is clear. Debt is power until it becomes paralysis, corporate leverage, and the illusion of growth. Governments aren't the only culprits. Corporations have binged on cheap money for decades. From 2010 to 2020, U.S. corporations issued more than $9 trillion in new debt. Much of it used not for investment, but for stock buybacks and dividends. Executives borrowed heavily to inflate share prices, enriching themselves through bonuses while leaving their companies fragile. When interest rates were near zero, it looked brilliant. Now, as refinancing costs double and triple, it looks suicidal. Zombie companies, firms that can even pay interest from their profits now, make up nearly 20% of all listed corporations worldwide. They survive only because creditors fear that mass defaults would trigger systemic collapse. The same dynamic infects the real estate market. From American suburbs to Chinese megacities, developers borrowed trillions, assuming prices would never fall. But rising rates have crushed demand. China's property giants, Evergrande Country Garden, have already defaulted, leaving behind ghost cities and unpaid workers. In the U.S., commercial property values are plunging as offices sit empty. Banks holding those loans face billions in hidden losses. Households on the brink at the bottom of the pyramid sit ordinary people. Credit card debt in America has surpassed $1.3 trillion. Student loans exceed $1.7 trillion. Auto loan delinquencies are climbing to record highs. Wages have barely kept pace with inflation, meaning more families are borrowing simply to survive. For decades, cheap credit masked stagnating incomes. It gave the illusion of prosperity. But debt doesn't create wealth. It borrows it from the future, and the future has arrived. When interest rates rise, the math breaks. Monthly payments spike. Defaults ripple outward from households to banks, from banks to investors, from investors to governments forced into bailouts. Every layer of modern finance depends on the layer beneath it continuing to borrow. When the bottom cracks, the tower falls. The central bank trap central banks were meant to be guardians of stability. Instead, they became the architects of the bubble. Since 2008, the world's major central banks have created over $30 trillion through quantitative easing, purchasing government and corporate bonds with newly minted money. That flood of liquidity pushed interest rates to zero, inflated asset prices, and encouraged reckless borrowing. But it also created a trap with no exit. If central banks keep rates high to fight inflation, debt defaults will soar. If they cut rates to rescue borrowers, inflation will return with a vengeance. Either choice destroys confidence in paper money. The Bank of Japan offers a glimpse of the endgame. After decades of debt accumulation, it can't raise rates without bankrupting itself, so it prints more yen to buy its own bonds, effectively monetizing the debt. The result is a currency that keeps weakening and a population facing rising import costs. Japan is the future just arriving early. The mathematical impossibility here's the brutal truth. Global debt cannot be repaid. Even if every country devoted all its tax revenue to debt service, it wouldn't cover the interest. The system relies on perpetual refinancing, issuing new debt to pay off old debt. That works only as long as lenders believe repayment is possible. Once belief fades, collapse follows. Consider this: in the next decade, over $90 trillion in global debt will mature. Governments and corporations must roll it over at much higher rates. If the average interest rate rises just 2%, annual payments would increase by nearly $2 trillion more than the GDP of Italy. No amount of productivity growth can offset that burden. The numbers no longer add up. Every path leads to default, either explicit through missed payments or implicit through inflation and currency debasement. The two roads ahead, the world faces two possible futures. Path 1: inflate away the debt. Central banks abandon the fight against inflation, slash rates again, and print whatever money is needed to keep governments solvent. Currencies weaken, prices soar, and savers are quietly robbed as their purchasing power evaporates. This is the Weimar Germany scenario, where money dies but debt survives. Path 2: allow defaults. Let over-leveraged governments and corporations fail. Debt gets wiped out, banks collapse, unemployment explodes, and a deflationary depression resets the system. This is the 1930s scenario where debt dies, but the economy shrinks violently. Policymakers will try to find a middle road. They'll promise soft landings, targeted support, temporary liquidity. But every measure to postpone pain only increases the final cost. History shows that once debt exceeds 250% of GDP, the global level, today there's no painless way out. Historical echoes: when Rome's treasury ran dry, emperors began diluting silver coins with base metals. Within a century, the denarius had lost 90% of its value. Trade collapsed, and soldiers demanded payment in gold instead of coin. The empire never recovered. When France's monarchy faced bankruptcy in the 1780s, it printed paper assignats backed by confiscated church lands. Inflation followed, confidence collapsed, and revolution swept the country. When Weimar Germany tried to pay its war debts by printing marks, the exchange rate went from 4 marks per dollar to 4 trillion. Middle-class savings vanished overnight. Out of the ruins rose extremism and dictatorship. Every hyper-indebted system ends not with repayment, but with reset through devaluation, default, or destruction. The only question is which form ours will take. The silent crisis already unfolding, the signs are everywhere. In 2023, regional U.S. banks like Silicon Valley Bank collapsed because their bond portfolios lost value as rates rose. In 2024, the Bank of Japan became the largest owner of its own government bonds. In Europe, energy subsidies and military spending have pushed deficits to wartime levels. In China, youth unemployment and property defaults are eroding social stability. Each event is treated as isolated. They're not. They're symptoms of the same disease. Too much debt chasing, too little real growth. Derivatives, shadow banking, and off-balance sheet lending amplify the danger. For every dollar of visible debt, there are several hidden obligations, guarantees, swaps, unfunded pensions. Add them all, and the true global exposure may exceed $500 trillion. That's why central banks are terrified of letting markets fall. A 5% decline in asset prices can erase trillions in collateral value, forcing margin calls and fire sales. To prevent that spiral, they intervene, creating more money, more debt, more fragility. It's a self-feeding loop with no natural end. The coming reckoning: at some point, confidence breaks. Maybe it starts with a sovereign defaultedly Japan, or even the United States missing an interest payment. Maybe it begins with a currency crisis, as investors flee to gold, Bitcoin, or commodities. Or maybe it comes from within a political backlash, demanding debt cancellation or universal income that the system can defund. When that moment arrives, trust in fiat money vanishes. Bonds are dumped, interest rates spike, and governments face impossible choices. Do they print more money and destroy the currency, or do they impose austerity and risk collapse? Either path leads to a reset. Some economists already propose solutions: a global digital currency controlled by central banks, debt jubilees, or coordinated inflation targets of 5 to 10% to erode real debt quietly. But each of these ideas amounts to the same thing: an admission that the old system is dying. What the reset could look like: imagine a scenario. Bond markets panic, the dollar plunges, and central banks coordinate emergency action. They introduce a central bank digital currency, CBDC, to replace cash and control money directly. Debts are restructured, savings are converted, and capital controls prevent withdrawals. On paper, stability returns. In reality, it's a new monetary order born from crisis. It sounds extreme, but history's turning points always do until they happen. The Great Depression birthed the New Deal and the dollar standard. World War II birthed Bretton Woods. The collapse of Bretton Woods birthed the fiat era. The next collapse will birth something else, perhaps: a digital, centrally managed financial system where money itself expires if not spent. The illusion of control: policymakers will insist they can manage it. They'll use phrases like macroprudential tools and yield curve control. They'll claim the debt is sustainable because we owe it to ourselves. But mathematics doesn't negotiate. Every dollar borrowed must either be repaid, inflated away, or defaulted on. There is no fourth option. The belief that central banks can outsmart the cycle is the final delusion of the debt era. Their models assume infinite liquidity, rational behavior, and political cooperation. Reality offers none of those. When confidence in money disappears, the system resets, not gradually, but suddenly, like an avalanche that builds silently until one snowflake to many sets it loose. The choice before us, the debt bomb, will not detonate because of a single event. It will detonate because of accumulated fragility, decades of small decisions made under the illusion that debt equals growth. Every politician who borrowed instead of reforming, every banker who leveraged instead of saving, every citizen who spent instead of producing, they all added a grain to the pile. Now the weight is unbearable. We can still choose how the collapse unfolds: slow erosion through inflation or sudden deflation through defaults. Either way, the age of effortless money is ending. The coming decade will redefine wealth, power, and stability. Nations with real assets, energy, food, manufacturing, will survive. Nations dependent on financial engineering will suffer. For individuals, the lesson is timeless: own what's real, produce value, and never believe that paper promises are permanent.